We're live.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Weiss. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled, Is Democracy in America Over? Featuring Jeff Meckler, Socialist Action candidate for the President of the United States, a leading member of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the Campaign to Free Mamoua Abu Jamal, plus discussants Hannah Leeknitz in Montreal and Brent Smith in Vancouver. Jeff will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by Anna for 5, and then Bryn for 5. Then we will take questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the questions directly onto the chat channel. Please direct your questions if you wish to a specific person or to all three. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So let's begin. Comrade Jeff Meckler is the National Secretary of Socialist Action USA and is candidate for the President of the United States. Jeff is a lifelong revolutionary socialist and anti-racist fighter, author of 25 books and pamphlets. He is the National Secretary of Socialist Action, the Director of Mobilization to Free Mamoua Abu Jamal, and a member of the Administrative Committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. So, without further ado, welcome, Jeff.
Elizabeth and comrades of our sister party, Socialist Action Canada, I'm honored to be with you on this election day, or the third day of counting the ballots in the United States. Our subject is something like, is democracy over in the United States? Let me give you a couple of statistics. But first to say that the final vote is not in, and we haven't yet determined in the United States who the next president will be. That includes me. They haven't counted my votes. And in fact, they don't count almost half the votes in the country. We have 250 million eligible voters in the United States, and at best, some 56% or 140 million of those have voted to date, which is the highest turnout ever. Most European countries have turnouts in the range of 70, 80, and 90%. So what's the reason why 45% on average of Americans don't vote? According to the statisticians, the central reason is they're disillusioned with the system. They don't think their vote makes a difference. Let's take a look at the democracy in the current election. This 2020 election represents the highest amount ever spent on an American election by a figure almost double the previous amount. And that is the parties of the billionaires, Democrats and Republicans, have spent $13.3 billion. And those were the figures just a week or so ago. The largest amount, whereas my campaign hasn't spent 1 billion or 1 million or 100,000. We are truly a rank and file working class revolutionary socialist party. Our calling card is not the fact that we're supported by billionaires. If that were the measure, Biden would be number one. with 131 billionaires contributing to his campaign, and poor Donald Trump with only 93. This is an election where ballot access is nearly impossible for anyone other than the Democratic Party. To give you an example, this is my second time running for president, but when I ran for the U.S. Senate and qualified for the ballot, I asked that my name be listed as Jeff Meckler, Socialist Action. And they refused to list my party, even though I was a qualified candidate. So I went to court and I lost the case. And a compliant judge ordered the lawyers of the Democrats and Republicans, ordered me to pay them $240,000 simply for their legal fees in defending themselves and preventing me from being on the ballot. That's the case with pretty much everywhere in the United States. In California, you require something like 240,000, where I live in California, registered voters to qualify for the ballot. In past years, our party and its predecessors have collected 500,000 signatures, only to be ruled off the ballot by technical reasons by various public officials who are Democrats or Republicans. So the idea that we have a true democracy where working people can run with their parties independent of and challenging the two capitalist parties have even a chance of winning is a crude joke. The last couple of weeks have been marked by quite a shock to the system. When President Trump announced, when asked whether or not on November 3rd, Election Day, he would accede to a peaceful transition of power had he lost. And he said no. He rejected counting the tens of millions, 60, 70, if not 80 million mail-in ballots that were legitimately cast according to the laws of all 50 states. And when asked why, he said he didn't think that they were legitimate. They were fraudulent. He was willing and stated his willingness to abrogate the right of some 70 million people. And if, he said, there were to be massive protests in the streets of those who disagreed with his disenfranchising a huge percentage, if not half, of those who were going to vote, he threatened to call out the federal police to crush peaceful demonstrators. That set the nation into a state of shock. So when election night came, people didn't know what the president was going to say when he announced his assessment on election eve, November 3rd, of where he stood. And lo and behold, instead of saying, I refuse to accept the vote, he said, I think I won. But if necessary, we'll go to the Supreme Court because these mail-in ballots are all fraudulent. If you listen to every television station in the country, there's no one who's making that claim. In Pennsylvania, where a decision is about to be made, or in Georgia, where it's close, within less a percentage point between Biden and Trump, the president's advisors claimed that they saw someone put 55 ballots on a stack after the election, a collection of ballots was made. All of the claims were spurious, but he literally threatened a coup. The result was quite shocking. Hundreds, if not 1,000 organizations in the country said they would take to the streets. The Rochester and Troy and Washington State Labor Council and others called on the National AFL-CIO to close the country down with a general strike, should the president dare to abrogate the right of millions of people to vote. Well, it turned out, like so many other things with Trump, to be bluster and bluff. And right now, as we talk, the entire country is sitting by watching the final votes in 5 states where it's too close to call. CNN and others say essentially Biden has won he will receive the necessary 270 Electoral College votes within perhaps this evening. That is Arizona and Nevada, where he is ahead and expected to win. He also may win as the votes, especially mail ballot, come in. So, in other words, the United States is on the verge of electing yet another capitalist candidate. The twin parties of capitalism will have prevailed in this election, leaving aside that 45% of people, that is mostly working people, don't bother to vote. Not to mention those who are not eligible, even though they have served their prison sentences, that is ex-felons. Not to mention 11 million immigrants who've lived here for most of their lives who are excluded from voting. So basically, half the people who live in this country, who work in this country, who contribute their labor, are excluded from this process. And yet we see every single night of the week and day of the week the television stations arguing about which billionaire should rule the country, a Trump or a Biden. Biden is projected by so many on the left, liberals, and tragically in the socialist movement, of the lesser of two evils, regardless of his record. And his record has been, after 47 years as an elected official in the United States, no different, if not worse, than most capitalist candidates. He was the Democratic Party whip, so to speak, in lining up the Southern racist, bigot, segregationist from the ex-slaveocracy. The Democratic Party has, since the 1940s, been the party of the Northern liberal capitalist class and the Southern slaveocracy. And I mean that. When I was a youngster and segregation was still legal in all public facilities in the South, candidates like Eastland from Mississippi or Faubus or George Wallace from Georgia were open segregationists, defied federal legislation that demanded that schools be desegregated, were openly associated with the KKK and White Citizens Council. And of course, when the mass civil rights movement in this country forced the abrogation of the Jim Crow laws that prevented equality in voting and every other aspect of public life, brought them down, the Democrats jumped ship and joined Nixon's Republicans in Nixon's great conquest of the former Southern slaveocracy. So the Democrats no longer had that combination of Southern bigots and Northern liberals. For example, when they ran JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, for president, his running mate was Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was an open segregationist who owned property which had codicils in it preventing it from being sold to Black people. He was a Texas racist bigot. So the Democrats had to solve the problem. How are we going to get that Southern vote that we lost? And they began a simple process. They ran the heirs of the old segregationists as their top candidate. They ran Bill Clinton from Tennessee or from Arkansas. They ran Al Gore, whose father was an open segregationist, Al Gore Sr. From Tennessee as a presidential candidate. They ran Jimmy Carter, who was a open segregationist in his days, in every way. Segregated churches, against school busing. In fact, he was a supporter of Richard Nixon. So they ran the Southern slaveocracy to head the Democratic vote party in order to win some votes. The entire system of the United States is a system that is, in my opinion, exemplified by the debate over COVID-19. Today, as we speak, at this very moment, we've recorded the largest number of any nation on earth on any day since COVID-19 presented itself. 100,000 plus people tested positive in the United States today. 230,000 have died. And the expected number to die by early February is 500,000. And if President Trump has his way of banning masks the number will go up to 1 million people dead in February. And why do I say have his way? There was a recent conference in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires, and it was presided over by corporations headed by the Koch brothers or by Charles Koch. And it was presided over by three professors, one from Stanford, one from Stanford, one from Harvard, and one from Oxford University. And they announced the Great Barrington Declaration, which basically said that the way to solve the COVID crisis was to return to nature. No masks, no protected, no gloves, no anything. Let nature take its course until society builds up a sufficient natural immunity, and then no one can catch the disease because they will be so-called immune, having contracted it. That simple fact, and I know you're standing there in disbelief, was attested to by the fact that Dr. Atlas Scott, who was one of the three drafters of the Great Barrington Manifesto, is now serving as one of President Trump's chief medical advisors. And in fact, he jumped the gun and went on Twitter and said that his administration is against wearing masks. Twitter banned his comment as unsubstantiated. But if you go by Trump's view, and the Democrats as well, they have the thesis that they counterpose two things: the basic health of the American people and the profits of the capitalist system. The result is, since the COVID-19 crisis began, all 50 governors of all states, Democrat and Republican, have proceeded to implement measures to open up the economy, because the only way that they survive under capitalism is the exploitation of human labor to make profits. No self-respecting boss would hire a worker if they didn't extract profits from them. And every single time, any city, whether it be New York City with its largest educational system in the world, 1.3 million students, opened up de Blasio, the mayor, or Cuomo, the governor of the state, every single time anyone took any move to reopen the economy, the result was yet another, a second and a third wave of COVID crisis, HARS, deaths, new infections, and higher infection rates. So death is inherent in capitalism when it comes between protecting its population, not only providing but mandating masks, not only eliminating the conditions that force people to go back to work, like they live paycheck by paycheck, like 4 out of 5 families must live paycheck by paycheck, or by eliminating evictions or mortgage foreclosures, all the things that force working people to go back to work every day in the face of unsafe conditions at the workplace. Of course, as a socialist, we would mandate that everybody stay home. Everyone stay home, except those special people who are needed to provide the basic services for survival. And for those people, we would provide them, as a matter of course, the same kind of quality medical care that President Trump had when he contracted the virus. And it would be free for everyone. And every single protective measure would be put in place. And their wages would be doubled, if not tripled, because of the risk that they are taking to save the lives of all of us. Under capitalism, the idea that workers should be protected first and foremost is inimical to their system of profit first. So we were shocked when the trade union movement, promising that they would organize mass demonstrations, backed off because President Trump backed off on his threatened coup. His advisors said to him, basically, if you threaten to abrogate the votes of 40, 50, 60 million people, you are thoroughly discrediting the system, not to mention the notion of bringing out federal troops to crush peaceful demonstrators. If you take a look at the 69 million votes that President Trump already has, which is larger than the number of votes that he got in 2016, you'll see that tragically the United States is deeply polarized between a right-wing racist bigot like Trump and a right-wing racist bigot like Biden with a smile on his face. Biden was the person who helped fill the jails to the brim in the prison industrial complex, increasingly privatized for-profit prisons where young people are incarcerated 80% for nonviolent crimes and work at Fortune 500 companies for literally 50 cents an hour. Why hire an immigrant worker for the minimum wage, if even that, when you can have the equivalent of a slave for 50 cents an hour? Why have an American job when you can offshore your jobs to Indonesia or China? China has 40 million people who work for less than $5 a day, which is less than $1 an hour. Why hire an American worker when you can have a Chinese or a Vietnamese or an Indian or an Indonesian or a Mexican worker? The two parties of capitalism are in absolute agreement on that. Trump said he'll bring jobs back, but after 4 years, the net of the jobs that have come back into this country is near zero. He's beholden to the same bosses that super exploit labor everywhere in the world. Trump does it with a vicious sneer and a threat of force. Biden does the same thing. In fact, when it comes to force, President Biden is a supporter of the Obama administration's 7 wars. Obama conducted 7 simultaneously wars around the world that murdered innocent people, 500,000 in Syria, 1.5 million in Iraq. These wars are still going. The United States has troops in 170 countries. The United States spends more on military, $1 trillion a year, than the combined expenditures of the 10 nations below it. And when Trump asked for an initial budget of $750 billion, the Democrats came back and added another $50 billion. When Trump, in order to pick up a couple of anti-war votes, because his political advisors tell him that if he sounds like a peace candidate, he might pick up a few more votes. When Trump said that he wanted to bring home some troops from Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq, he was condemned by the Democrats, who insisted that the United States stay strong, that Trump stop downgrading NATO, that the American military establishment be made greater than ever. Of course, Trump was just playing the game of rhetoric, like when he claimed publicly in his first debate with Joseph Biden that he was the best presidential candidate for the American people since Abraham Lincoln. Trump, the fool that he is, literally had his name put in for the Nobel Peace Prize when the United States has troops in virtually every major country on earth. And they are troops in the form of privatized army troops. There were more than 50,000 of those in Afghanistan. That is privately paid corporations that provided soldiers to fight American imperialist wars, along with the regular armed forces. And then we have drone wars, special operations wars, sanction wars, like the sanctions imposed on Cuba or Venezuela or Iran. Any nation that dares to challenge American imperialism is sanctioned. I just mentioned 2. Why Venezuela and why Iran? Why are these nations driven to poverty, hunger, and terrible social conditions at home because of American sanctions are in the are targets of the United States. It's not coincidental that Venezuela has the largest known oil resources in the world, and Iran is fourth. And neither of them, because of the U.S. sanction, can sell oil on world markets. And Venezuela, the proceeds from Venezuela's oil deposited in banks across the country through their corporation called Citgo, have been illegally commandeered or stolen by the United States government on the grounds that President Trump, supported by the Democrats 100%, announced that they had the right to appoint the president of that country. The United States backed a fascist-led coup in Bolivia to replace the leader of that country because Bolivia is rich in natural gas. The United States supported a fascist coup in the Ukraine because Ukraine is among the largest nations in the world with natural oil gas reserves in the east. And the United States wanted to block the Russian pipelines that were previously supplying oil to Western Europe and have American corporations do it. In all of these cases, the Cold War hysteria, the new Cold War hysteria promoted by Democrats and Republicans, the arms race that never ends, are a reflection of the declining state of American imperialism. The need to go to war, the need to spend trillions of dollars on military spending, unprecedented amounts, is a reflection of the crisis of American capitalism. War spending is a very, very profitable industry. Its demand is constantly kept up by going to war and using up the war machinery, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the ammunition, the soldiers, and all the rest. And because the war industries are overwhelmingly monopolized, they can charge anything they want. I asked my friends in the audience to guess how much it costs to manufacture a toilet seat on a nuclear submarine. The answer is $10,000 for a toilet seat because the military industrial complex has a monopoly, as they do on the prison industrial complex, as they do on the oil industries. The 4 or 5 oil corporations that dominate oil production are in the back pocket of the Democrats and Republicans. That's the reason why under the Obama administration and Trump, the United States has become the largest leading exporter of deadly fossil fuel and the #1 fracker of the world. President Obama made the United States the fracker in chief. President Obama deported 3 million immigrants in the United States with a smile, whereas President Trump threatens to do the same thing. We live in unprecedented times, times where the United States faces more existential crises than ever before. The claim that we have an unemployment rate of 7%, 7.6, which is the highest in the modern era, is debunked by the fact that the labor participation rate, according to the United States government figures, is 65% or 67. That is 37% of the eligible American working people have no jobs. And if they do, they're part-time gig economy jobs. Capitalism has no solution to those. It has no solution to the climate crisis, which threatens in the immediate term, literally in the next half decade or so, oblivion for the people of the earth, displacement of millions of people, unlivable conditions everywhere, not to mention the forest fires and the hurricanes we've experienced this year in California and in the Gulf Coast. The United States continues to press on with fossil fuels, again, because it's profitable, regardless of the cost in human lives. Send people back to work in the face of COVID-19, because it's profitable regarding the cost in human lives. The war machine, because it's profitable, even though it takes the lives of tens of millions. The United States killed 4 million people in the Vietnam War. 4 million people because they refused to accept the right of Vietnamese people to self-determination, to run their own country. The United States killed 80,000 people in Nicaragua by supporting counter-revolutionary armies that the U.S. financed illegally because they opposed the right of the Nicaraguan people to self-determination, to decide their own government. And the same thing with Grenada. The United States invaded this tiny island nation because they moved in the direction of breaking with capitalism. And of course, you can name 45 to 50 countries over the last half century that has suffered direct intervention and takeover. In 1954, the United States overthrew the Guatemalan government, and in the course of the next years killed 400,000 indigenous people.
2 minutes.
Even President Clinton had to publicly apologize for the slaughter of 400,000 people. The middle name of capitalism is death and destruction. We're revolutionary socialists, not because we like to tout the word revolutionary as if we run around with guns and a red flag. It's because we believe that all the issues that I've mentioned today, inherent racism, systemic racism that brought out 26 million people in the streets in these past months against what everyone now understands is the systemic racism in this capitalist system. Inherent in capitalism is racism, LGBTQI discrimination, endless wars, unemployment, environmental destruction, denial of civil liberties and fundamental democratic rights, persecution of immigrants in order to keep them down, to provide a low source of workers for the capitalist class. On the positive side of the equation, we see a deep radicalization among young people. 54% of people, young people today, who are less than 39 years old, prefer socialism over capitalism. Those are the people who you don't see. Those are the people who are in the streets. White youngsters standing side by side with their black sisters and brothers protesting police murder and police brutality. You want to be part of a movement to challenge this with the perspective of winning over the majority of working people who have no interest in any of the horrors of capitalism. You should join Socialist Action. And if you're in Canada, join Socialist Action Canada. If you're in the United States, join its sister party, Socialist Action United States. You can reach us at socialistaction.org. And Elizabeth and Hannah and who's our other friend? Brian? Brent, thanks for joining me today. I'm honored to be on the same platform. And thank you all, comrades and friends.
Thank you, Comrade Jeff. Okay, our next speaker, Hannah Leeknitz, is studying history at Carleton University and is secretary of the Montreal branch of Socialist Action League for Action Socialist. Hannah is a strong proponent of queer liberation and equality rights. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for speaking to us. It has been intensely stressful as a Canadian American the past couple of days, just to see all of the things that President Trump is putting up online. And I can't say that I am surprised, but I will certainly say the things that he says, the things that he is willing to say, and the things that his supporters are willing to back up are most certainly the musings of a fascist. And And thankfully, I have been seeing, at least in the past few months, the rest of the left acknowledging that. And even liberals are starting to acknowledge that Trump is a fascist. For a long time, many people were not admitting that it was as big of a problem. People were thinking, it's just 4 years of this guy. And then as soon as these 4 years are done, we kick him out and install someone blue who's willing to have a couple women around. But this term has made a lot of young people realize that that is not the case. There are a lot of people that I knew who were apolitical, maybe a little left-leaning in high school, and now in college are communists. They're socialists, anarcho-syndicalists. We are all looking for different solutions, politically speaking, because the mainstream political landscape of the United States and also of Canada don't represent our views. Here in Canada, I would like to say that a lot of us like to think that we're better than the United States because we don't have this duopoly, the two-party monopoly over politics. But the fact that we have three parties and the fact that one of them, the least popular of the three, obviously we do have more parties, but there are, 3 or 4 big ones: the Liberals, the Conservative Party, the New Democrats, and the smaller Green Party. The fact that the NDPs are proponents of the labor movement still doesn't mean that they represent our views. And I'm finding a lot of people really not happy about that. Obviously, Canadian democracy has never truly represented the people. I mean, I should say that, it's only been about 100 years that in Canada and in the United States, women were able to vote. And I don't remember exactly how long it was until people of color were allowed to vote in Canada and the United States. But a lot of the way that our system is set up in Canada still purposefully disenfranchises Indigenous folks who don't have the right to self-determination, who don't really get to rule over themselves, and who don't acknowledge Canada's claim to their territory, Canada's government positioning themselves over them and deciding how they're going to live. We are not much better in Canada than in the United States, just because we have, a couple of people who are a little bit more left, and perhaps just because our Conservative Party is more comparable to the Democrats than the Republicans, does not mean that.
1 minute.
Thank you. Does not mean that Canadian democracy is any more safe than American democracy. But a bit of hope. The fact that young folks are turning away from capitalism and turning away from mainstream political ideology means that we as socialists have a wonderful opportunity to bring people into our circles, into our fold, and tell them, yes, we can band together, we can organize, and we can make the world a better place.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Brent Smith. He's a leading member of Socialist Action in Vancouver. He's a spokesperson for ACORN, the Anti-Poverty and Tenants' Rights Organization. Brent was the ND candidate in Surrey, White Rock, coming a close second there in the BC provincial election, and actually still waiting on the final count to see if he could even be in first place. So welcome, Brent.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Hannah and Jeff uh, for your remarks. I agree with Hannah in that this election is, it's difficult to talk about, but I'm going to do my best. And I'd like to relate it back to what goes on in Canada. Now, I know a lot of Canadians get very upset when you compare Canada to the United States and suggest that what's going to happen in America happens here. But it's very difficult to ignore the parallels, particularly coming off the heels of some of the more undemocratic measures that we've seen in Canadian electoral history. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. What's often forgotten is the 2011 robocall scandal, where conservative actually misdirected Canadian voters based on their polls with robocalls, telling them that their polling station had moved to a different location. This meant that some 8,000 presumably liberal voters were not able to get out and vote. Only one person, a low-level staffer, was ever arrested and spent a year in jail. But it's clear from the paper trail that he couldn't have done it alone. I think that we see a lot of these undemocratic measures being imported, while at the same time we have to remember there is still the will for those things. So we see Harper's Conservatives, for instance, introduce extreme party discipline into Canadian federal politics, which leads to the sort of quagmires that we're seeing now, where one government comes in, implements a massive agenda, and then another majority government comes in, undoes the entire previous agenda, and implements something new. All the while, they can have majority governments without being fully representative of the people. The Liberals' majority government last time around had 40% of the total popular vote, yet they were rewarded with a supermajority. And this leaves left-leaning parties like the NDP more or less to the wayside. In this election recently, they've been the kingmakers. They've held or at least done their best to hold the Liberals to account on certain issues like pharmacare and childcare and pandemic care. But they're faced with new innovations in undemocratic parliamentary measures. So, for instance, very recently, the BC Liberals tied a commission which would have investigated one of their scandals to a confidence motion, essentially challenging the opposition to collapse the government if they wanted to seriously investigate what the Liberals were doing. The NDP in that situation had to step in and essentially vote the Liberal line. Otherwise, the government would have collapsed and we would have moved to a federal election. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these measures being implemented. We're going to see a lot more of these undemocratic efforts take place. And as much as, like I said before, Canadians don't like the comparison to the United States, I think there is evidence there. As Elizabeth mentioned, I was a participant in the BC election. And just recently, that election is beginning to conclude. But the BC Liberals, the day after the election, put out a fundraising email to their followers demanding that they investigate the mail-in ballots and put out emails asking for funds so they could hire lawyers to observe the mail-in ballot count, which is a deeply bizarre, deeply undemocratic thing. And I don't believe that it would have happened without the influence of our American neighbors to the south, without having suspicion from on mail-in ballots and suspicion as to whether they're legitimate or valid being cast on them down south. I don't believe that that kind of email, that kind of messaging could have gone out and successfully worked without that. So here in Canada, I think what we have to do is we have to be vigilant. We have to be prepared for challenges to our democracy because, as Hannah mentioned, it's extremely young, and it's only recently in recent history that everybody's even been given franchisement, the ability to vote. It's only in recent history that our vote moved away from only being a landlording sort of class vote, only property owners being able to vote, to a full enfranchisement. And even then, as Jeff mentioned, turnout is extremely low in Canadian elections as well. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do in order to make sure that our democracy is kept safe. So, and expanded, of course, in order to make sure that it becomes truly representative of everybody. With that being said, I unfortunately will not be able to stick around for the Q&A portion. I'm very sorry about that. My busy schedule has been it's been a lot recently, but I want to thank Jeff and Hannah for being on with me. I want to thank Elizabeth, and I want to thank Kurt for doing an amazing job behind the scenes. So thank you very much. Sorry that I can't stick around to answer questions. I would have loved to, but thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak.
Elizabeth, you are muted.
Sorry about that, folks. Thank you, Brent, very much. And now we're going to, with the help of our technical producer, Kurt, there's some questions from our online audience, and we will take 3 questions. Kurt will put them in the chat as well. And then our speakers will have up to 5 minutes each to answer the questions. And our first speaker will be Jeff and then Hannah. Go ahead, Kurt.
Okay, the first question will be coming from myself. And I ask, according to a Princeton study, the U.S. is an oligopoly where only the rich 1% have influence over federal policies. What is needed to rally the American people to alter this fact? Barry Weisletter asks, some labor councils and unions in the USA threatened general strike action if Trump attempts a coup. Does this indicate an opening for independent working class political action, even a Labor Party? And Elizabeth, our chair, asks, question for Jeff. Trump was just on TV saying mail-in ballots should not be counted. He has been cheated out of victory. He vows he will go to the Supreme Court to overturn the election results. He is doing this, and the results are not even completed. Do you think this will lead to civil war, or at the very least having Trump run again in 2024 if he loses this time?
Okay, so Jeff, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'm glad Elizabeth was watching the television. Trump was expected to make an announcement. I didn't hear it directly, but that's what he threatened several weeks ago. And that is, if he loses, he would go to the U.S. Supreme Court, which he dominates by 6-3. I don't think the ruling class wants to abrogate the election. And in all of the results that have been posted over the last 3 days, there has been no evidence whatsoever that there's been any fraud within the framework of the capitalist system. All of the secretaries of state, if not governors and senators, who are aware of what's happening in their states, say that all ballots that were cast were in accord with state law. So for President Trump to go to the Supreme Court and have them reverse that decision and annihilate 60 million people would be an atrocity that I don't think the ruling class of the United States would tolerate. They would tell the Supreme Court, who reads the headlines, and as the saying goes, that we're not going to allow you to codify a presidential coup. And if they did, I can only imagine that the protests in the United States would be unprecedented and massive. They would make the 15 to 26 million people who came out in support of Black Lives Matter look like small demonstrations. I don't think the ruling class of the United States wants that to happen. They believe they have control of society regardless of which capitalist party runs the show. They don't need the ugly side of dictatorship and implied fascism that Trump represents to be the governing force in the United States. Second question is related to the first. Yes, it is a oligarchy, 1%, the ruling rich, The people who own and control the wealth, who own the means of production, control the politicians. It is an oligarchy, but it gives the impression that it's a democracy. And that's what the elections are all about. To once every 4 years allow one of the two ruling class parties, who are portrayed as representing the American people, to the exclusion of everyone else, to have a contest as to which section of capital will rule. So we do live in an oligarchy. The Occupy movement exposed that 1%. As far as the Labor Party, I have to say that that's not on the immediate agenda for anyone. The labor movement has been reduced to the smallest percentage of organized working people in the history of the United States. The labor bureaucracy is tied hand and foot to the Democratic Party. And even the resolutions passed by the various labor councils simply called on Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, to consider a general strike. And when Trumka privately called the meeting of the major unions together and word got out, he canceled the meeting. He issued a statement saying only nothing about a general strike, but that the AFL-CIO supports the Constitution of the United States. But the United States labor movement at this point is near bankrupt. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground floor up. And the harbinger of the forces that we saw can do that were the Black Lives Matter and their allies, 26 million young people who work for a living in non-union shops. The labor movement only has 6% of the private sector organized, and the public sector unions are essentially tied to the Democratic Party, almost 100%, mobilizing votes and raising money for the Democrats. Yes, we need a labor party, a mass-based working class party, a party similar, if not better, than your NDP in the United States. If we had one, we would participate in it. We are advocates of it. Our election campaign has traveled around the country till we basically were stopped from traveling because of COVID, advocating that working people break from the Democrats. At the same time, I'll conclude with this thought. There will never be a Labor Party in the United States that is stillborn, that is declared by a few labor officials without the direct correspondence of working people fighting back at the point of production. When it happens that working people take the class struggle road and challenge the bosses and rebuild the unions and throw out the old bureaucrats and build brand new unions, those people who are in the leadership of those on the ground struggles will be the ones that will break from capitalist politics and begin the process of organizing the power that workers have demonstrated in the streets, in the political arena. So working people have two formations to fight with: their own party to fight in the political arena and their own fighting labor movement to challenge capitalism everywhere.
Okay, Hannah?
All right. Yes, thank you to Kurt, Barry, and Elizabeth for the questions. Kurt's question was it was regarding a Princeton study. I haven't read the study. I haven't heard of it. But it does instinctually ring true to me based on what I know about American politics, that only the rich 1% should have influence over federal policies. What I'm familiar with is the fact that the people who are able to rally behind specific parties and push them in a direction that benefits them is corporate donors, is the owners of large corporations, is billionaires, and they are the ones who are able to get whoever's in office to pass bills that, if they want to, roll back labor laws, and and lower their taxes. What is needed to rally the American people to alter this fact? I would like to say that time. I think that while I don't think that sitting around and waiting for the revolution is exactly the move, I don't think that's the move. I think that we do need to be active. We need to do what we can, that which is within our means at the present moment. But what I'm seeing, what we're seeing, just like Jeff said, the Black Lives Matter movement was able to get 26 million young people on their feet in the streets, standing up against police brutality. And a lot of those people, if not liberals, are left of liberal and have a lot of criticisms of liberalism as the institution that governs their country. And that's not to say that Trump himself is liberal. I think we are heading in a direction that looks good for us as socialists, but we need to be patient, and we need to keep fighting. So thank you for that question. Barry, some labor councils and unions in the United States threatened general strike action if Trump attempts a coup. Is this indicative of an opening for independent... I've lost the question. Independent working class action, even a Labor Party. What Jeff has said about the American labor movement, I'm really not familiar. I'm not read up on anything concerning the labor movement within the United States, but I definitely, the hopeful part of me likes to say it would be a good opportunity. If there was a general strike, should Trump attempt a coup, if people were to hop on board with it, that would be an amazing opportunity for socialists to jump on and say, we have a common cause. All of us, every member of the working class, is struggling against this same oppressive force. I think that it would be a good opportunity for us, and I think the hopeful among us should continue to keep working. The last question was Elizabeth's. She says, I realized that it was a question for Jeff, but I would like to weigh in. Does Jeff think that Trump challenging the mail-in votes could possibly lead to civil war? I don't particularly think that it would lead to civil war, solely just because the police are so heavily armed in the United States, and Trump at his disposal, at least for the next couple of months, has the State Guard and the entire American military. Should the people rise up, they are not well armed enough. They are not organized. I have a strong feeling that if there was even a motion to organize an uprising and fight back against, at least against the government right now, it would fail. However, if Trump did decide to declare himself the ruler, the supreme chairman of the United States of America, I strongly feel as though many Americans in the military, and even perhaps some on the police force and the National Guard, state guard. Pardon me for not being intimately familiar with all of the terminology regarding these matters, but a lot of them pledged their allegiance to the flag, not to Donald Trump. Thank you. I think that some of them, in the worst case scenario, there will be many people who will want to fight for their country against Donald Trump and against what he stands for. But there are also a lot of people who like Trump, like what he says, and they would like to see his vision manifest in their country. And so a civil war is possible. I feel as though it's probably not in the books. It is probably in the books, rather, but I don't feel as though there's a high probability, I meant to say. Anyways, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Kurt, we'll go back and take 3 more questions, please. And this time, each speaker will have up to 6 minutes. We'll go with Jeff first and then Hannah. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, it didn't register. So we have 3 questions for this one. And the first one is from Julius. He asks, is the huge support of Trump an indicator of the bigotry of millions of Americans, or does it mean something else? Does the election result reflect a hardened division in the American ruling class on how best to deal with the capitalist crisis? Ellen Ramsey asks, I see that popular vote is almost 50-50 between the 2 candidates. Is this significant, and what does this mean for the road ahead? Roy Jones asks, do the panelists agree that raising the consciousness of the working class would be the correct way to move towards democracy?
Okay, Jeff, 6 minutes.
Jeff, you're muted.
Actually, the popular vote has Biden ahead by 3 million. It's the largest turnout in the last percentage in the last period, but it's still only 56-57%. But yet, even though Biden is ahead by 3 million, Trump got 69 million votes. So who are they? Are they racist bigots? Are they neo-fascists? I don't think so. I think they're people who haven't bought into the idea that the Democrats are the party of working people, and they tend to do good, and the Republicans are the party of the bosses. The Democrats under Obama bailed out the U.S. corporations to unprecedented amounts, trillions of dollars of bailouts, massive deportations, massive fracking, and massive loss of jobs. Those are undertakings by Democrats that didn't meet the needs of working people. So when Trump was first elected, he presented himself as the populist candidate against the Washington swamp, against the Hillary Clintons. They were pulling down $200,000 for speaking engagements before the major corporations in the world. That is, the vast numbers of the American people, I don't think, buy into the idea that the Democrats are the liberals and the Republicans are the conservatives. They're hard hit, all working people, by the crisis of capitalism, by the figures that I gave you. A labor participation rate where 35% don't have anything resembling a real job, live in a gig economy, can't afford to live anywhere near the way their parents did, can't afford to pay their rent, not to mention buy a house, not to mention have medical care. So there's plenty of blame to go around. And I don't think we're facing a fascist threat in the United States, although I must say that 69 million votes for a racist bigot like Trump is a frightening vote. It is an example of a polarization of American society. You know, I appreciate Hannah's comments because she was grappling with a difficult question. Civil war. I mean, my gosh, yesterday we were going to baseball games or, enjoying family friendly events. And now we're talking about a civil war with battles in the streets. That's not on the agenda. But if the government of the United States were to declare an election null and void, it would, in my opinion, set into motion unprecedented mass mobilizations that can, in certain historical times, raise questions that nobody ever thought of before. What are we doing in the streets every day of the week? What are our demands? The problem is that nobody has answers to those questions. When I mentioned 26 million people in the streets led by Black Lives Matter, hear me, the Black Lives Matter movement, almost 100%, its leaders went into the Democratic Party to get out the vote for Biden. That's a tragedy. We live in a situation where there is no serious leadership of the Black community, independent of the Democrats, independent of the Al Sharptons who organized the March on Washington to get out the vote, of the Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives, which had a national conference of Blacks that attracted hundreds of thousands of people, all aimed roughly at getting out the vote for the Democrats, or the Black churches or the Latino churches as well. They mobilized for the Democrats. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of nonprofits, in quotes, that are paid by the corporate elite to hustle votes for the Democratic Party. And the state of the movement regarding independent formations is at an all-time low in my lifetime. Tragically, most of the socialist movement ended up, the so-called socialist movement, and I'm not talking about Bernie Sanders, Democrat, so-called democratic socialists. I'm talking about major socialist organizations like the ISO that claim 1,000, sometimes 2,000 members that disintegrated overnight with the huge numbers of its members either supporting Biden or going into the DSA, whose top leaders, despite their convention, turned around to hustle votes for the Democrats. There were no formations. We tried through through United National Anti-War Coalition to put together the beginnings of a coalition to mobilize in the streets. Our middle name in Socialist Action and the reason for our participation in every social justice movement, whether it be for civil liberties, democratic rights, freeing political prisoners, freeing all prisoners, for Pete's sake, most of them there are because of the racist criminal justice system, ending the war budget. Our middle name, Mass Action, is to bring people into the streets so they feel their power, so they begin to break with the idea that you can't fight City Hall, but they are the majority. And when people begin to act in their own class interest and feel their power in the streets like they did with the Black Lives Matter mass protests, everything that was impossible yesterday can become on the order of the day today.
Thank you, Jeff. Hannah?
The first question is from Roy. Did the panelists agree that raising the consciousness of the working class would be the correct way to move towards democracy? I definitely believe that this is a crucial step. I believe that it is one of the most important steps towards democracy. We do need to increase class consciousness among, I should focus on American politics, but within Canada as well. I grew up in a lower class, working class household. And in terms of family members and family friends, there was so little class consciousness. I would meet people who would make about 18 grand a year who still were just like, when I get rich, or if I was my boss, I wouldn't want to be taxed any more than I already am. It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't understand, in hindsight, I don't understand how these people can vote and speak against their own interests to the benefit of the class that oppresses us. And increasing class consciousness among the working class, among the lower class, among the American populace as a whole, that's where it's at. Like, we really need to be speaking to people, sometimes people that we don't like, working class people who maybe have some backwards ideas, who maybe don't have some progressive ideas. Perhaps I won't be the one talking to all of them as a queer person, but class conscious young people need to start pulling our weight instead of just sharing things on Twitter. And yes, I am calling myself out, probably more so than a few other people in my groups. But yes, class consciousness is the way forward. Julius's question: is the huge support of Trump an indicator of the bigotry of millions of Americans, or does it mean something else? That's just the first part of his question. But again, I would like to say that a lot of Americans feel as though their interests align with their bosses, align with the capitalist class. I saw an Instagram post. I promise this is relevant. I saw an Instagram post wherein somebody just put up a screen cap of a conversation with one of their friends. They texted her and they were like, "Oh, did you vote?" And she's just like, "Of course I voted. I voted for Trump. I don't want to get my taxes raised." And the first person was like, "You're a waitress and you make $7.50 an hour." There are a lot of people who are so misinformed. And I really feel as though it is that misinformation that is leading people against Biden. I feel as though he wasn't a good candidate. He wasn't the best option to go up against Trump. Although I do believe that bigotry plays a part into it. I don't think that is the majority of the reason why Americans voted for him. I think to imply such would be an oversimplification. Does the election result reflect a hardened division in the ruling class on how best to deal with the capitalist class? I would say so. I would say that there are a lot of people who understand the class divide, and then a majority who don't. And it's up to us to talk to them. Alan, I see that the popular vote is almost 50-50 between the two candidates. Is this significant, and what does this mean for the road ahead? Well, it's 50-50, quite frankly, because we don't have people in politics to represent what we really believe in. The furthest left party, the one who Republicans, like people on Fox News, are calling communist, socialist, center-right, centrist. It's a lot of Americans had to resort to settling for Biden because he was going to be the better of the two. And at the end of the day, they're both corporatist parties. Thank you, Elizabeth. They're both corporatist parties, and none of them truly represent our interests. I think that the corporate goals that the Democrats are going to help the ruling class possibly led some people back towards Trump, unfortunately, which is a sad state of affairs. We don't have anyone who represents all of our beliefs. I think that's what it means.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt now, our producer, for our last two questions. And the speakers will get up to 6 minutes each to answer. And I will go to Hannah first. and then to Jeff. And also, if you want to make any closing remarks in that 6 minutes, do so as well. So, Kurt?
All right. So our first question comes from our host, Elizabeth, and she asks, some leftists outside the U.S. think the DSA represents a genuine radical alternative to the parties of the ruling rich in America. What is a policy of the DSA? And Barry Weisletter asks, is the Canadian state democratic? From the perspective of the working class, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially given growing inequality, what is real democracy?
Okay, Hannah, you're first. You have up to 6 minutes. Is Anna there?
Her video and is off and she's muted, so
Hi, Anna.
Technical difficulties.
That's okay. So turn your mic on, and did you hear the questions?
I did hear the questions. I was
Okay,
able
so
to
you
hear
have
them
up to
most of it.
6 minutes.
Some leftists outside the US think the DSA represents a genuine radical alternative. In terms of the DSA's policy, I will admit I haven't read up for myself, but I do know that at least among certain members of my circles, the DSA represents my circles being radical far left circles. The DSA represents a departure from mainstream political ideology that is perhaps not extreme enough in order to be as impactful as we would like. I'm afraid I don't have a whole lot to say on the DSA. If I was more familiar with them, Elizabeth, then I would.
That's okay. The second question, if you want to.
For sure. Barry asks whether or not the Canadian state is democratic. Well, I want to say yes. I do want to say yes. In terms of the working class, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially given growing inequality. To say what is real democracy, to ask a question like that, I would like to give an answer that real democracy is when every single member of our country has an opportunity to voice their opinion, to say what they want, and to have representation within our government, the way that our laws are made, and the way that our laws are enforced. Within Canada, we have an extreme amount of disenfranchisement. We have, I would say, a large portion of most communities of color not happy at all with the way that our laws are enforced. People of color are much more likely to be targeted for crimes. They're much more likely to be spotted and for police to profile them as being criminals, regardless of whether or not they're innocent. I would also like to add that though there have been movements to defund the police across Canada and also in the United States, taking money away from a certain group of police, from a certain police force, I feel is almost, even though it is even though it is material change, I feel as though it's performative. I feel as though a lot of it is the system saying, okay, a lot of people are not happy with the way that things are run, and we need to maintain the illusion that the power is in the hands of the people. When in reality, the police exists to maintain the hierarchy that keeps the ruling class where they are and keeps us down here. For Indigenous folk, their voices are just not heard. They're much more, they're disproportionately homeless or lower class, addicts. I've met a number of an exuberantly disproportionate number of homeless people on the streets of Ottawa and Montreal are Native American. They're either Inuit or they are the First Nations from around these cities. And the government isn't really doing much to address that systemic issue, because addressing that systemic issue would mean calling their power into question. I don't feel as though we have real democracy, but the ruling class has certainly maintained the illusion with a marvelous grace.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Okay, Jeff, 6 minutes.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank Socialist Action Canada and Hannah and Bryn. I'm honored to be with you and to see that you've recruited two young, enthusiastic, talented, and informed young people. I like to refer to one of my favorite movies that unfortunately not everybody's seen. It's called The Truman Show. Elizabeth, have you seen it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The Truman Show is a fellow named Truman who lives on an island, every person on which are actors except him. And the director is a major Hollywood producer who orchestrates 24 hours a day life on this island, including Truman, who doesn't know that it's a fake world that is being created around him, including a woman who's been assigned to be his lover, and then his wife, and his neighbors, and his bosses, and the policeman, and the local pharmacy people, and the insurance company. They're all actors. We live in a Potemkin village world, in a Truman Show world, where every aspect, every minute of our life is orchestrated by corporate media, by the capitalist class, by the bosses. Marx said that the ideology of society is the ideology of the ruling class. And that is, they tell us what to believe. They tell us that blacks are a threat, that Latinos will take our job, that radicals are going to prevent them from going back to work to earn a living. You had the terrible, frightening spectacle of immigrant workers going into meat processing plants elbow to elbow with COVID infections, having taken Tylenol to keep their temperature down so they could work for slave wages for one of the major food corporations, Tyson. Because working people don't have a choice but to work or starve or to be in the streets. So they're frustrated when someone says we should keep it closed. They go along with the capitalist propaganda that the capitalists are providing jobs for everyone, as opposed to offshoring jobs. That the capitalists are denying the science of climate change because it's profitable for them, and therefore they have to tell the people that it doesn't exist. There is no such thing as science or Trump's herd immunity. They have to create a world for us embedded in which is the superiority of their class, of their values and their rule. They are the 1% or less, 1/10 of 1%, but they create a world for us. And it's only when the conditions of the world they create are so intolerable that people take to the streets, talk to each other, organize, defend each other, mobilize, that they begin to realize that this Truman Show world is not theirs, it's not real, and that they have to struggle against it. The majority don't rule this country. The country is ruled by the ruling class. They have levers of every single political institution. And then when all else fails, as Trump hopes, they have 9 people on the Supreme Court, including this new racist bigot appointee, anti-pro-choice, anti-abortion, reactionary on every question, even on climate change. They think that she and her colleagues are going to decide the future of humanity. Even if the American people vote for one capitalist candidate against the other, Trump thinks that his 6 votes are going to keep him to be president. That's undemocratic. We would abolish the notion of a Supreme Court in the first place. Socialism, in contrast, is the first society in the history of the world where the majority of people rule in their own name through their own institutions, councils of workers, where workers are chosen directly from the factories, from their places of work, to come together and decide in the context of their owning and controlling the wealth of the nation, the means of production. We would eliminate on day one the private ownership of the multi-billion, multi-trillion-dollar fossil fuel industry. We would abolish the military that denies the world, the people of the world, the oppressed nations of the world, the right to self-determination, because a capitalist class deems that they need to demonize the leaders of those countries in order to go in and steal the resources.
1 minute.
Well, socialism is the majority rule. It is the coming to power for the first time in history of the majority class, not the old slavocracy, not the feudal aristocracy, and not the capitalist duopoly. It's working people directly ruling their own lives and having the capacity to make fundamental changes. Let me give you some example. Working people ruled the society. We wouldn't need to have locks on supermarket doors. We wouldn't need to have clerks at the cash registers. We wouldn't need guards. We wouldn't have to worry about the quality of food or the poison in food. Come and take what they want because we can produce enough food, quality food, for every person on the planet Earth. We can eliminate fossil fuels and institute a sustainable energy system that is free from the deadly greenhouse gases. So we have to break with this notion that the capitalist class represents anything in the interests of American working people. We want to abolish it. And you can only do that by winning,
Have to wrap up, Jeff.
by winning over the hearts and minds of the majority of the American people. We're not an isolated group that runs around with guns or rhetoric thinking that we can change the world by ourselves. We seek to build a mass party of working people embedded in, ingrained, and integrated in all the struggles of working people for every right: human rights, Black rights, Latino, Native American rights, environmental rights. That's why we ask people to join our party, join Socialist Action Canada, participate in the multiple struggles that they do. And if you happen to be in the United States, join Socialist Action. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so special thanks to Jeff, Hannah, and Brent, and to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and to everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper. It's only $27 for 1 year, delivered to your door. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, just write to Socialist Action Canada at gmail.com or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. Once again, if you like the show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next Socialist Action webcast is on Thursday, November the 12th at 7 p.m. Will the pandemic ever end? The speakers are Daniel Terade in Toronto and Dr. Robbie Mahood in Montreal. For the details, just visit socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now. Okay, we're off the air.
Not yet.